Hi, welcome to the third of the free Geography Geek sessions for acing your NEA. So far, we've hopefully got a title in place and we've had a look at how we should lay the document out. And today, we're going to actually start writing. So today, we're going to look at the introduction. Now, an introduction is going to set the scene for the rest of your project, and there's certain things that need to be in it just to make sure that you hit that mark scheme. Now, the kinds of things that I would put in an introduction would be something about the location of the place. So introduce the location to the reader. And that's going to involve some maps. It helps to have 3 maps. So you'd have a map where you're zoomed out. Maybe you can, if you're doing it in the UK, maybe you can see the whole of the UK. Then you might have a map that's zoomed in on the region or the individual city. And then you might have a map that's zoomed in on the locality that you're going to be studying. Remembering that maps need to have a title, a scale, often people forget that one, and a direction arrow. When you've done that, you need to put your key questions. So we talked about those in session number 1. So you've got your 3 key questions. They need to be linked to the spec. The examiner needs to know that you know what you're doing and you know which bit of the spec you're looking at. So you need to dig out the spec, look at the AQA website online, and work out exactly which bits of the spec that fits into. I'm going to give you an example in a minute of what that means. Finally, the bit that people find super tricky is the literature review. And a literature review is where you do some reading. You know, you're an A Level student, you should be studying, you should be reading. So you want to show the examiner that you've read about your topic and that you found some information that is relevant to your study. Now, it's worth spending a bit of time to get this right, because later on in the project, you're going to have to keep referring back to that literature. And if you pick literature that's really hard to refer back to, well, you're just making your life more difficult and you wouldn't want to do that. So let's have a look at what this looks like in practice. So I've got an example NEA here, and we've got a clear heading that says introduction. I can see it's 1.5 lines spaced. Brilliant, looking good so far. We start with the overall aim of the study, which is quite nice, and it's telling me that there's 2 localities within a city that we're going to look at. And then we've got the sub-question. So the first sub-question is here. And this person has linked it to the spec. So they've picked out the spec, they've found the exact wording in the spec. But what they've also done is they've not just linked it, they've explained it. So they've said how it links to the spec. They've then got some literature. We're still in the same first key question. They've got some literature and they're telling me about how green spaces are essential for the well-being of the population. There's a positive correlation between the amount of green spaces and household income. Right, now this here, you could go out and test that. So that is a really good piece of literature to put in. So that's great. And then we've got some more research. Now it comes from Chile, but it doesn't matter because the same research could be applied to the UK. It's basically just talking about where green spaces are in relation to income. And that's fine, it's something else we can come back to. And you can see this is actually packed with literature, which is brilliant. Then, very clearly, next paragraph starts with the second sub-question. This person has linked it to the spec and explained the link. Bit more literature. And then the third key question, written it out, again linked it to the spec, explained it and given me some more literature. Now, you can set this out differently. You could have the links to the spec as one section. You could have your literature review as a section on its own. But it's all got to be in there somewhere. And if I scroll down, I've got some maps. I've got a map of the UK. I've got a scale on there. It's not an ideal scale, but it constitutes a scale of sorts. I've got a direction arrow. I've got figure numbers, so that's nice. So it's all looking good so far. Let's have a look at the mark scheme. So if we have a look on here, this is the mark scheme that your teacher, and if your work is sent off, the moderator would use to mark your work. And this is all about the introduction and your literature review. So there's 2 things that you need to do. You need to define the research questions. So that's about linking them to the spec. And you want it effectively identified, completely referenced to the spec. So you want to explain that reference to the spec really well. And the second part is all about the literature review, well supported by thorough use of relevant literature sources. Now, I think for an A-level piece of work, they're not going to expect it to be too much literature. I would normally advise at least 5 pieces of literature. If they're really good and you can link them to the topic, that would be sufficient. And of course, what you don't want to be is down the other end of the table. You don't want to be down the no marks end of the table. If you just don't meet that criteria at all, it's really difficult for your teacher to be able to allocate any marks to that. In reality, what your teacher would do, they'd highlight the bits that you fit on the first row, highlight the bit on the second row, and they'd look at whether it was roughly a level 3 or a 2 or a 4. Hopefully, you want to be more near the 4. And this is worth 10 marks in total, so it's worth doing a really good job of. That's it for this section. Next time, we're going to come on to look at the methodology.